It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears got a lot more exciting this offseason, but how much better did the team really get overall from top to bottom on the roster? We'll explore. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at Cox Sports 1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook or join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. Don't forget to also check out the full Locked On Bears YouTube channel, now running full steam ahead. Subscribe, like, comment on our videos, join the conversation, have some more fun with us in person on video. You can see me doing the podcast instead of just listening to it on your normal podcasting apps. Anyway, today's episode, we're going to get into this Bears roster a little bit. Now that we're at this stage of the offseason where, mini camps, OTAs, all that stuff's done. Players are more or less on vacation, on their summer break before they come back for training camp. It's possible the Bears could add some veteran free agent here or there, but for the most part, it seems like the dust has settled for now. And this is what, generally speaking, the 90-man roster is going to look like entering training camp. So it's a good opportunity for us to check in and kind of go position by position and check in on, okay, who's gone, who's here, and really make sure we've got a full stock of the situation and say, on paper, is that an improvement? The changes they made this offseason, is that an improvement? Or are some positions at risk of going backwards? Because every offseason, every team thinks all of their moves are going to make them better. Of course, you wouldn't make a move for your team if you thought it was going to make you worse. I guess if you were tanking, maybe the Detroit Lions are working on that. That's a jab and a discussion for another podcast. But generally speaking, anytime the Bears sign a player, trade a player, release a player, draft a player, they're expecting those moves to help make the team better. But every team thinks all of their moves are going to make them better. And every season we see not every team gets better. Some teams just have to go backwards because it's 32 teams and they all play. So someone has to win and lose every game. So some teams are going to lose, even though they thought everything they were doing was going to make them better. So as we look at this Bears roster a little bit, we can start to see, okay, on paper, are there areas we should be concerned about moving backwards, considering some of the salary cap casualties they made, or were the additions they brought in enough to really make the positive change that this team is hoping to see? So, of course, everything starts on offense with the quarterback spot. That's the big one, right? That's why we feel so much better about this Bears roster in general. The state of the franchise was just like lifted. This stress and this sort of pressure of like, oh man, what's going to happen with this team kind of cools down a little bit when you've got a franchise rookie quarterback that the city is in love with. Clearly, big upgrade at quarterback to go from Foles, Trubisky to Dalton, but more importantly, Fields. That's where the upgrade is going to be for the Bears. How much of an upgrade to be determined, but on paper, you look at the quality of quarterbacks they had last year and the quality of quarterbacks they have this year, and you feel like that's a pretty positive step in the direction, even with Nick Foles still technically on the roster as that quarterback 3. So quarterback is that step forward. Running back, I think, also represents somewhat of a step forward in the sense that Tariq Cohen was injured for almost all of last season. They only got a couple of games out of him before he tore his ACL. Him returning will be an upgrade compared to what they had last year. Gone is Cordero Patterson, but we all kind of know that running back experiment. He was thrown in there and they relied on him when they needed him to, but it wasn't like it was a smashing success. It was mixed results at best. How about that? And then they signed Damian Williams, of course, and that is an upgrade from Ryan Nall or Artavis Pierce or whatever sort of running back 3 you want to pick from last season. Improvement at running back. Maybe it's subtle. Maybe it's not game changing. It's still David Montgomery is the lead guy, the workhorse guy, but improvement in the depth and some veteran talent there nonetheless. Tight end stays pretty much the same. Cole Kmet, Jimmy Graham, Demetrius Harris, the number 3 from last year. He's gone. They got Jesper Horsted and Jake Butt. Maybe that's a change, but the guys who matter, the guys who are going to play, tight end stays the same. Wide receivers pretty similar too, all things considered. It's still Robinson and Mooney. Anthony Miller's still there. Javon Wims still there. I think both of those are a little bit of a surprise at this point in the season, in the offseason, but Riley Ridley's still there. Marquise Goodwin has the potential to be an upgrade there down the line. He hasn't played meaningful football in 2 seasons, so as much as we can get excited about that, there's still something to be proven there. I mean, I'm willing to say he could represent an upgrade at wide receiver, but for the most part, things are relatively the same there. And then you get to the offensive line, and that's where I start to have my biggest offensive concerns, because you cut Charles Leno and you cut Bobby Massey, and certainly there was a clamoring to upgrade those positions. Absolutely. The Bears needed to try and upgrade this offensive line this offseason, but Leno ends up being a little bit more of a salary cap casualty as opposed to like trying to purely upgrade that position. Bobby Massey, you can kind of make the argument either way, but the bigger picture here is that I don't feel like they upgraded from either one. Maybe we were ready to move on from both of them, but I don't think week 1, 2021, either offensive tackle position is going to be better. Tevin Jenkins, long-term, is going to be, or is supposed to be, a better offensive tackle than either Leno or Bobby Massey. That's why you drafted him so high, but it's not necessarily fair to expect a rookie to step in day one at a new position at left tackle, mind you, and instantly be better than the guy who'd been starting there for 6 or 7 years in Chicago. I mean, there's a separate argument to be argued about how good is Leno and how good is Massey, but it's going to take a little time at least before Tevin Jenkins is up to like veteran starting caliber tackle. Then on the right side, it's competition: Jermaine Ifedi, Elijah Wilkinson, Larry Borum, perhaps. We talked about this a little bit on yesterday's podcast with their free agent pursuit of Morgan Moses. As much as we liked what we saw from Jermaine Ifedi last season, especially down the stretch, it felt like he was settling in at right tackle. He has a track record in the NFL of, again, 4 or 5 seasons of below average offensive line play. And so I'm weary of a recency bias of saying, well, the last time I saw him, he was a lot better, so therefore he's supposed to be a lot better from here on out. That's the hope. And by all means, that is the hope. And that's what the Bears should shoot for. But I'm weary that the track record speaks louder than the last 6 or 7 games that we saw last season. And so I'm not confident that overall this offensive line is really upgraded. And I think at least at first, if not longer, it's going to be a little bit of a downgrade, and it's more of a long-term offensive line building strategy. So there's a potential step back there, and that can have other effects on the rest of the offense. And really, we saw other departures on this roster that also add some of that sense of pause of like, well, wait a minute, how much better are they getting? Especially a few different key spots on the defense. We'll circle over to the gains and losses there and where they should be all right and where there's some question marks about development next on Locked On Bears. I think you can sense some of this question about did the Bears get better or worse when you look at the betting odds at betonline.ag, because they're coming off an 8-8 season. I know now we're going into a 17-game year, but the over-under for the Bears win total is set at 7.5. That's technically a half a game back. The Bears made the playoffs last season. BetOnline.ag has the odds right now in the favor of the Bears missing the playoffs. The underdog bet would be that they make the playoffs. Matt Nagy's got odds for first coach to be fired, the third most likely on their odds. It's a great opportunity for you, though. If you're confident in this Bears team and you want to lay some money down on their success, betonline.ag is the number one place we recommend, and it's the number one place we trust. Where else can you find some of these great prop bets on football at the end of June? Head on over to BetOnline and sign up today for a free account. And don't forget to enter our promo code LOCKEDON, and you'll receive a free 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. This Bears defense has a coaching change at the top, and that's certainly going to be a factor. And we'll get into coaching a little bit later on in the podcast. But this secondary is where the concern starts for me with the turnover. And of course, safety position is top to bottom the same, right? So if we want to start there, it's Eddie Jackson, it's Tashawn Gibson. You even brought back Deion Bush and DeAndre Houston Carson. I guess if you want to get technical, last year they had signed Jordan Lucas from Kansas City, and he opted out of the season. he's coming back, game changer, big time, number 5 safety is going to be world of difference in that secondary. No, he might play special teams, but safety, pretty much the same. Cornerback is, that one's where you start to raise the red flags. I think at this point, between that and the offensive line, cornerback might be where I have the most concerns right now, just from such a lack of proven reliable talent. And when you release someone as high quality as Kyle Fuller, someone as good of a fit in this scheme that the Bears are trying to get back to with their new defensive coordinator, I understand there's salary cap implications and that sometimes those things can be necessary evils, but for me, it represents a loss in talent. And Desmond Trufant can come in, and he's been a quality veteran in the past in Atlanta. He was hurt last year in Detroit, so I'm not trying to hold that year against him too much. And maybe there's some recency bias on me thinking, well, he hasn't done much lately, and so we don't know how good he can be, but he has been a starting caliber cornerback, and he can do that. But that represents a downgrade from Kyle Fuller, or maybe it's Kindle Vildor or Duke Shelley, but both of those guys, extremely unproven. I mean, we're talking a handful of total NFL games that they've ever played. One of them will likely end up as the slot guy to replace Buster Skrine. Those of you who have been listening to this podcast long enough know I've never been a big Buster Skrine guy. I felt like he was kind of the most vulnerable part of this Bears secondary in the past. So I'm not sure that you're going to see a huge downgrade from like a Duke Shelley or Kindle Vildor in there, but it's all sort of probabilities here that probably one of those two young guys would be pretty good, but I guess there's a chance that they're not. Probably Desmond Trufant will be an average starting cornerback, but there's a chance that he's not. And I certainly don't trust the depth. If anybody gets hurt there, you start to have to throw in maybe your rookie, the rookie cornerback, Thomas Graham, or I don't know, Trey Roberson, Artie Burns. I mean, it's not necessarily a deep group at cornerback. So that's where I start to feel the least secure about where this Bears defense is. Because, you go back through the rest of the team, or the rest of the defense, inside linebacker, same group. I mean, it's Roquan Smith, Stan Trevathan, Josh Woods, Joel Iyiegbuniwe. They did sign Christian Jones on the reunion tour back to Chicago. That'll be nice to have him here. I mean, that's good linebacker depth. I feel a little bit better with an injury there. He can play some special teams. He might even be able to play some outside. He was, I think, an edge rusher in college when the Bears brought him in and made him a linebacker. And in Detroit, they used him in some hybrid roles. So maybe there's a fun piece there. But for all intents and purposes, inside linebacker, pretty much the same. Outside linebacker, you swap out Barkevious Mingo, bring in Jeremiah Atochu from the Denver Broncos. Different types of players, some different style to them, maybe a slightly different skill set. But if we're just sort of like saying overall talent level, better or worse, I mean, I'm not sure their Madden ratings are going to be too different. You know what I mean? If you're trying to think of it in those terms. So swap out a third outside linebacker for a new third outside linebacker. I'm kind of willing to call that pretty much the same. Defensive line, you almost lost Akeem Hicks, and we still haven't fully squashed the rumors that he could still be traded. I don't remember which NFL insider person had said that, those discussions are still sort of possible, ongoing. The Bears gave Hicks the permission to seek a trade, and one never happened. But one of the insiders, I don't know if it was Kaplan or Garofolo or one of them, said that could pick up steam again by training camp. I mean, it all feels very sort of speculative and not like firmly reported. But there's a concern there. But you lose Roy Robertson Harris and Brent Urban, who was a very good rotational player last year. You replace them with Angelo Blackson and Mike Pennell. They can both be average, fine guys, but there's a reason Roy Robertson Harris signed for a big multi-year deal, and you get Blackson and Pennell fairly cheap when you do. So I think the defensive line takes a little bit of hit with depth when you go from, presumably Goldman will be back, which is a big boost. Don't get me wrong, but in terms of like where your lineup is, I mean, Hicks, Goldman, Nichols with Edwards versus Hicks, Goldman, Nichols with Edwards and Roy Robertson Harris. I mean, it's not drastically depleting the defensive line by any means, but if we're really stacking them up, and you got last year and this year is just maybe a little bit lower, then we'll call it slightly worse on the defensive line. But overall, right, this is not a depleted group up front. The concern remains for me in the secondary, and I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on a lot of different people in this organization. Not only the young players on the field that have to go through some of this fairly quick development. I mean, this is going to be year 3 now for Duke Shelley, year 2 for Kindle Vildor. Vildor at least didn't really have a full offseason last year. So, like with the rest of the rookies, you're sort of expecting that now that he gets to be working out with the team and going to in-person practices in May and June, that can help accelerate a lot of his development, just like Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney and some of the other guys that we've talked about recently on the podcast. There's some hope there. Duke Shelley in year 3, start this, he's 6th-round pick, so expectations are where they are there. You shouldn't expect him to be this starting caliber cornerback all of a sudden, but now we're starting to get a few years in, and eventually you kind of become, it is what you are, after 3, 4, 5 years in the NFL. He's kind of falling into what he's going to be at this point. Maybe you get a surprise pop-up from Artie Burns turning his career around in Chicago. He was hurt. He came to Chicago last year in the preseason and training camp, tore his ACL or season-ending injury. I don't remember for sure what the injury was off the top of my head. He's back. Maybe the change of scenery, a new scheme, a new defense can kind of rejuvenate the former first-round pick. You get something there. Trey Roberson from the Canadian Football League. I mean, he was a big Bear signing last year. Again, wasn't part of the team last year. So there's you can find these little bits of there's optimism here, there's hope there, there's a path where this works really well, or 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 there could be a path where none of them work very well, right? That's sort of the on paper probabilities we're trying to play a little bit at this stage in the offseason. But all of that to me signals right back to coaching, and in particular, new defensive coordinator Sean Desai has some big shoes to fill and some pretty high pressure to succeed. And I also point back to offensive line coaching, some of the different offensive guys. Matt Nagy, a ton of pressure on him and a lot falling on the shoulder of Justin Fields. We will go a little bit deeper into some of these key stakeholders that are really going to determine whether the Bears do improve or not, regardless of what they look like on paper, next on Locked On Bears. This episode of the Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at BuiltBar.com. And I'll tell you what, I love my Built Bars. I cannot get enough of them. I have to limit myself to eating just one a day because they taste so good. They're the world's best tasting protein bars because they don't taste like regular protein bars. They taste like candy bars. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. So you're getting a sweet, delicious treat, but it's low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. Seriously, 130 calories, 17 grams of protein, and it tastes delicious. Where else are you going to get something like that? I'm telling you, doesn't matter what flavor. I've had all of them. They're all incredible. Salted caramel, my personal favorite. Raspberry also up there for me. Coconut, cookies and cream. I mean, they've got something for everyone. Head on over to BuiltBar.com and use our promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. When I try and figure out, okay, where is this Bears path to improvement here? Of course, there are upgrades on these rosters, and those players are going to help bring this team up. But for me, it comes down to Justin Fields, Juan Castillo, and Sean Desai. So for me, when you upgrade the quarterback position, it's why it's the most important position in all of sports. Because if that player can play at an elite level, especially in this case, on a rookie contract, it makes everyone else's job easier. I think literally every other position on the team, maybe not the long snapper. I think the long snapper's job is probably the same with or without a good quarterback. But everybody else, it makes their job easier. If you have an effective quarterback that's a threat to your opponent, your running game is much more effective. Defenses are playing back a little bit more to stop the pass. Your running game has more room to work. They're not loading the box as much. It makes your running back have more room to work. I mean, it makes everyone's job easier there. Offensive line, if you're with a quarterback like Justin Fields, with his mobility and his pocket presence, the offensive line doesn't have to be as perfect as it might have needed to be for Mitch Trubisky or Nick Foles. Sometimes that pressure can affect them more so than a quarterback like Justin Fields. Again, assuming he can elevate to the level of play that we saw from him at Ohio State. Like if this works, it makes the offensive line better. It makes the running game better. It makes the receivers so much better. That how often have we felt like Allen Robinson's whole career, he's been held back by quarterback play. Last year, Darnell Mooney, sort of a opening breakout, but we're ready for that next, the big breakout. Like, he's made a name for himself as a 5th round pick, but now he's got a quarterback that can presumably hit him on the deep balls and use more of that vertical speed and can really kind of unleash the full Darnell Mooney and not what felt like a little bit more of a limited option, a limited usage last season where it just wasn't quite everything Mooney is capable of. It goes top to bottom. Cole Kmet, Jimmy Graham, even guys like Anthony Miller and Javon Wims, whoever's on the field, if you have that elite young quarterback play, it makes their job easier. And it makes the defense's job easier too, because if you're not behind on the scoreboard or always, tied and tight, the defense can play a little bit more loose, a little bit more relaxed, maybe more aggressive as well. And it starts to make the opposing offense a little bit more predictable, that if they're behind on the scoreboard, they're going to pass. You don't have to worry about the play action as much fooling you, because you got to be ready for the pass. They can't keep running the ball or let them run the ball if they want to run while they're losing that badly on the scoreboard. That type of elevation from the quarterback play is so important. And that involves Matt Nagy putting Justin Fields in the best position to be successful, calling plays that he's going to be comfortable with, getting his receivers open and in route concepts that are going to work for the quarterback that he can read and that he can find. It's going to fall on Juan Castillo, the offensive line coach, because Justin Fields can help an offensive line look better, but he can't do it all, right? I mean, if it was week 1, it's probably going to be Andy Dalton week 1, but if it's week 1 and Aaron Donald's just beating the offensive line in your face every time, no quarterback in the NFL can withstand that. Or if it's, Khalil Mack coming off of the edge and your tackle is just a turnstile, Justin Fields can't make up for that necessarily. So Juan Castillo, the offensive line coach, is going to be absolutely critical for this team being better rather than worse. Developing Tevin Jenkins and making him as prepared as possible, leaving him in one spot and saying, this is what you're going to do. Be the best left tackle you can be. Figuring out the right tackle competition and getting it right the first time. I think we've seen too often in recent Bears history, even before Juan Castillo, that they have a competition at a position and they start one guy week 1. And by week 5, you realize you got the wrong guy and you try somebody else. And all of a sudden you're rotating in these different offensive linemen and you kind of realize that you didn't have the right guy from the start. So that's keeping Cody Whitehair in the same spot. If he's going to play guard, keep him at guard. Don't move him back and forth between center and guard. Same with James Daniels. If he's going to play center, leave him at center. Don't move him over to guard. I mean, if there's an injury, that's out of the coach's control. But too often it's like they haven't always been able to get their guys in the right positions that they need to. And so that's going to come down a lot to the offensive line coach knowing his guys, knowing which positions they're going to be successful, and executing that at a high level. Then I come back to Sean Desai. When you have these deficiencies, these departures on defense, particularly in the secondary, as the Bears look to change a little bit more of what they want to do from a schematic standpoint in coverage, getting back to more of the Vic Fangio, too high defenses, a lot of quarters coverage. Fangio, compared to what we saw with the Chuck Pagano, would do a lot more cover 6, some more of the pattern match zone coverage defenses where part of the time it looks like man-to-man on one side and zone on the other, and it's a lot more confusing and less predictable for opposing quarterbacks to diagnose. You've got to be able to find the right mixture of coverages that get these players, again, it's all about best position to be successful. You hear the coaches say it all the time. You just don't always see that actually executed by the coaching staff. For me, this idea of the scheme change starts with Eddie Jackson, getting him back to that 2018 level where he looked like maybe the best or one of the best safeties in the NFL. Like that's like priority number 1. If I'm looking at, did Sean Desai do a good job this season? It's did Eddie Jackson get back to being Eddie Jackson? Because we know he's got the talent, right? We're not positive about Duke Shelley, Kindle Vildor, how much talent they really do have, what they can and can't be. We don't know what that ceiling looks like. We don't know exactly what level of Desmond Trufant we're going to get, but we do know what Eddie Jackson can do. If he's in the right scheme with the right players and the right coaching around him, that's where Sean Desai needs to absolutely make his bread and butter. That's where his money is going to be made, is right there in that safety at the top of your defense. Because the front 7 is going to be about the same. It's going to be fine. I mean, they still got the same pass rushers. They still got the same linebackers. Defensive line, enough is still there. They should be fine with those front 7 guys, but it's all in that secondary. It's all about those mixes of coverages, not only throwing things at the quarterback to confuse them, but not overloading your guys with too many different things for your defenders to have to know, and too many different adjustments and too many different responsibilities. There's a fine line there between making it hard on the offense and making it easy for your guys without it being too easy for the offense to read or too hard for your guys to execute. And that's where the job of the defensive coordinator is so important, and why it's so valuable that so many Bears players have come out and said, like, we love Sean Desai. I've had this relationship with him for 3, 4, 5, 6 years because he's been here through multiple defensive coordinators. He seems to have a very good sense of his guys. And that's something that we haven't always been able to say about the Bears managing their own talent. Desai seems to have that foundational knowledge underneath. So I'm excited to see how he pulls this Bears defense together. You can be sure we'll be keeping a close eye on all of that all offseason long right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you subscribe to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Not quite full 5 days a week at this stage in the offseason. We're still at the end of June, but as we get closer and closer to training camp, we are going to ramp back up to our full Monday through Friday production for you. So I hope you're following along. I appreciate everyone who's listening, everyone who's checked out the Locked On Bears YouTube channel so far. Really encouraged by the growth so far, but I want to keep it going. Please subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Like our videos, comment on those videos, share them. That's what helps us grow and reach even more Bears fans, because there's a lot of Bears fans out there like you right now that want more Bears football. It's June. There's nothing going on, but the Locked On Bears podcast is here to bring you that football 365, 24/7, all around the calendar. The NFL never sleeps. The Locked On Bears never sleeps. And all of that makes it that much easier for you to bear down.